The following video contains the animated short Pwned by Sophos, followed by a Gula Tech Adventures interview with Black Lotus Labs threat hunter Danny Adamitis.
Welcome back to the For Recovering CISOs podcast show, where we discuss the latest cyber news.
Let's continue with the live read of the Pacific Rim Report from Sophos. Joe, pick us back up from where we left off.
Sure thing, sure thing. While conducting a post-mortem review of the Asnarox attack, X-Ops built a specialized kernel implant to deploy to devices that Sophos had high confidence were controlled by groups conducting malicious exploit research. The tool allowed for remote file and log collection without any visible userland artifacts.
You've got to be f***ing kidding me.
What's wrong, Bill?
What's wrong? This language sounds like normal IT talk, but let me fix it. Instead of X-Ops built a specialized kernel implant, say they built malware. Instead of deploy to devices, say hacked or better, messed with a nation-state.
I thought they were doing this sort of analysis on Sophos customer-hacked devices.
No. They literally deployed it to a developer system who was working on exploits they had encountered, and some they hadn't over the 5-year period.
And you could replace customer-hacked devices with C2. Everyone's IP shows up in someone else's threat feed eventually.
If they put the implant on a customer C2 and had permission from the customer, I could see you being okay with that.
Sure. If it's in someone's house, you can do whatever you want in there. But I really don't like the idea of putting an implant on an offensive operator keyboard.
Calling it an implant reminds me of the early days of EDR, when carbon black salespeople were telling me their agent was a kernel sensor. Dangerous stuff deploying in the kernel.
Regardless what you call it, I'm really against this sort of hackback activity.
I'm surprised to hear you say that because you are ex-Cyber Command.
Look, I don't mind if you use a company like Sophos or Palo or Crowd to help kick a nation-state out of your house. But when you do so by going back into the attacker's house, China, in this case, you are opening a Pandora's box of potential issues. Nation-states have a lot of other potential actions, other than cyber.
Oh, come on, Bill. There are millions of actively compromised systems all over the world now. In China, too. Is it a big deal if a Chinese commercial exploit an offensive company got hacked because they are hacking too?
Actually, I'm starting to agree with Bill here. What if this started a lot more cyber counter-hacking or vigilante activity?
Bring it. We have to do something to remove the threat. If the nation-states can get hacked, it might tip the economic incentives for them to hack small business, which is too easy for them now.
Linda, you are not being realistic. Look, the main way counter-cyber operations work is they are found in the private sector and then silently taken down through coordination with the vendors, government agencies, and our allies. If we start giving letters of marque to anyone in that community, it will disrupt the trust there, and without trust, you will just be taking down small parts of nation-state operations.
Letters of marque?
Letters of marque, historically, were government-issued documents that authorized private individuals, often ship captains, aka privateers, to attack and seize enemy ships during wartime. These letters essentially legalized acts of piracy when conducted against a designated enemy, allowing privateers to claim captured goods as spoils.
It was a sanctioned form of private warfare.
Look, Sophos gets a lot of credit here for being transparent, but I can see them and others advertising. Buy our firewall, it does deep packet inspection and automatically disrupts adversaries by hacking their dev systems.
Gary, you don't think this sort of thing goes on all the time?
It may, but again, Sophos gets a lot of credit for putting this in a report as is and letting the debate rage in the public.
Debate. The general public really doesn't seem to be tracking cyber. The entire goddamn core internet has been compromised by China, and no one seems to care.
You mean Salt Typhoon?
You mean China hacking the United States' wiretapping system?
You mean China exploited a mandatory backdoor placed by the United States government?
I can't believe you all feel that way.
Unfair? Look, the Constitution says
The Constitution! Oh, please!
that we have the right to bear arms. Exploits are like firearms and guaranteed by the Constitution.
You are confusing the issue. I don't care if you have a gun or an exploit, just don't take them to a foreign country. You might start a war.
I'm tired of that argument. Why can't we just do what China does, but to them?
Whoa, Alinda. What are you saying?
Bill keeps saying hacking back could start a war. China has hacked billions, if not trillions of dollars worth of intellectual property, backdoored countless government and private citizens, and even planted potential backdoors in our critical infrastructure.
You want to do that? We are the good guys. We are a free and open society.
Wake up, Bill. Look at the Israeli pager attack.
Let's get back to letters of marque. What sort of qualification do you need to be to get one of these letters? Are you a Lone Ranger? Do you need to be a Microsoft? Do you need to be a 100% U.S. sovereign entity?
Yes, and yes. We need help. Defense is not working.
Oh, please. We know how to secure a company. We just lack the will to do it. Don't risk a cyber war.
We are at Cyber DEFCON 5 right now, and no one seems to care. The government can't be the sole proprietor of offensive cyber operations.
I tend to agree with you, Linda. All my spooky government cyber friends go on and on about how much more intel they have than the private sector. But then I see things like Salt Typhoon, and I have to ask myself, did the government do a great job and stop 100 of these other typhoons, and this was the only one that got through? Or was the first time they heard of this was when someone from the private sector knocked on their door?
That's what they call a public-private partnership.
All right, we are at time. We will do a brief sponsor read, and then get everyone's final thoughts, which I'm really curious about. Linda, you have the sponsor this week.
Thanks, Bill. This episode is brought to you by Sention. They make it easy to automate compliance and harden every endpoint with standards like the Center for Internet Security and those recommended by NIST and the DoD. I'm also a customer, and I can tell you they also do drift detection of system configs, and that's a great way for finding
Chinese malware.
Is that your final thought, Joe?
I'm all for commercial offensive activities for one reason: innovation. If the private sector is incentivized for stopping cyber attacks and can use counteroffensive operations, who knows what they will innovate? What we are doing now surely isn't working.
Gary? Look, I'm also reluctantly for offensive work because cyber is not that important.
What? Cyber isn't that important? Explain.
Of course, in our world, cyber rules, but we live in a bubble. Regular people, non-cyber people, really do not seem that concerned with cyber issues. Because of this, I think we are never going to get the resources to secure our applications, protect our data, or get the funding to do any of this.
That's dark, man. Really, really dark. Linda, you are on this bandwagon to hell as well?
I am. Look, I have a t-shirt signed by Rob Joyce himself that says impose costs. China hacks. The ransomware groups hack because it's easy for them. Like Gary says, we aren't doing a great job as an industry making it harder for them to attack us. So let's get in the fight and disrupt their operations with new and innovative techniques. Now, Bill, you get the final point.
Look, I could not disagree with your arguments more. 1, this is questionably legal and certainly ethical. 2,
Oh, I see. Bill gets multiple final words.
2, we never talk about collateral damage. What happens if Coke is defending their secret recipe and they have to go through some systems run by Pepsi? 3, say what you want about the government, but they have oversight from the White House and Congress and a variety of federal courts. And 4, and my final argument, is we still have an attribution problem. In Pacific Rim's case from Sophos, they showed their work, and it really does indeed look like China. But most incidents could easily be faked to look like someone else's work. And the government has spy satellites, maybe even spy drones, informants, input from our allies, and lots of other things the private sector will never have for attribution.
All right, thank you, Bill, Linda, and Joe. I'm Gary Smith. Thanks for listening to this episode of For Recovering CISO.
Hi there, it's Ron Gula from Gula Tech Adventures, and in this week's video, I sit down with Lumen threat hunter Danny Adamitis. Danny, how are you?
I'm doing great, Ron. How are you?
I'm doing much better that I've got your name right. For some reason, I get real nervous about getting people's names wrong and stuff like that. So how did you become a threat hunter?
So I actually started off as a linguist way back in the day. So when, I think I told you this, when I actually graduated college, I focused on international relations and diplomacy at our lovely school, Seton Hall, go Pirates. And I actually had a major in Russian language. So when I first started doing this, I was actually kind of looking at things like Russian crime forums and trying to figure out what those guys were doing as part of kind of my day job. And as part of that, you just start seeing people talk about things like what is an exploit, what is a fully undetected payload, what is this malicious macro. And as part of kind of my translations, I would just say, but what is that really? So then I would start kind of reading books about what is a malicious macro, what is a PowerShell loader, how do you write fully undetected malware? And after you start doing that and just kind of iterating over that process again and again, you kind of start to build up that really strong technical knowledge. And at a certain point, I just kind of found myself more interested in the actual technologies and how they were being exploited than I was in just translating the comms.
So I get that, and I think a lot of people are going to resonate with that, but there's a big difference between doing PowerShell on a VM in your school's lab or your home basement or whatever, and doing it for Lumen, right? You're working with customer traffic, internet traffic. This is a position of trust and responsibility. So how did you end up there doing this kind of research?
So obviously things start there. I actually went and I previously worked at a company called Cisco. So for those of you who are familiar, they're a very large networking firm. So they do a lot of things with routers, with switches, with firewalls. At the time, we also had OpenDNS. So you kind of start to learn a little bit about things like the DNS infrastructure, about how switches work, about how routers work. And again, that just kind of seemed like a really interesting area of security for me to explore. So as I was there, we started learning more about these kind of ecosystems, and naturally, as you start to focus on those technologies, it leads you naturally into the ISP and the telco space because that's who purchases a lot of this equipment. So after we started doing more research, we started seeing, well, how can someone potentially exploit these sorts of technologies or these devices? It kind of leads you to more of that ISP-focused malware families or those threat actors. And as time, I started to find myself getting really interested in that. And then it got to the point where I said, this might be really interesting to see if I can do better, if I could do more by just kind of owning an entire ISP or trying to help one company specifically rather than trying to, attack this from a vendor's perspective.
And it's funny, I know what you mean when you say owning an ISP, but I know other people mean they want to control the ISP, that sort of thing. So like when you go to work, you're going after, let me rephrase this, right? So I think a lot of people in cyber are familiar with there's a vulnerability. I got to patch the vulnerability. You're way before that, right? You're looking for people exploiting things, exploiting backdoors, before anybody knows about that. So like when you go into work, like what do you do? How do you hunt?
So that's a very fun question. And the answer is it kind of changes every day. So as you kind of noted, I actually have this really nice position, thank you to all my Lumen counterparts, where I get to do what's called like threat research or threat hunting. So my idea is I'm trying to find the actors who are attempting to exploit our systems before they actually get there, or trying to look for what they did once they were in there. And again, a lot of that is looking for just anomaly-based detection. So again, a lot of the things we do is, I think we've talked about this, more of like the big data analytics and looking for those sorts of weird anomalies that may exist. And then you also kind of pair that with some fun research you might be doing about emerging technologies. So again, I think one we talked about last summer was actually like things like DNS over TLS, where this was a kind of a new way of doing DNS. It's supposed to be more privacy conscious, more security involved, but the idea is you're also creating this encrypted channel that could be used for data exfiltration. So how do we start to look for some of these nodes that are exhibiting malicious DNS over TLS characteristics before they're being used to actually target us or our customers?
And it's got to be tough because there's so much disintermediated content out there. Like if I just installed some software, right? It's on every one of my computers at Gula Tech Adventures. It all connects to a known command and control thing. That could be my patch management software. That can be Automox. So how often do you go down a rat hole of investigating something and you find out, oh, it's just a new Juniper VPN or a new video game on Steam?
That happens more than you would think. Where again, there's a lot of times where if you're looking for malicious, DNS servers, you're going to run across something from Google. You're going to run across Yahoo. You might run across some kind of smaller ISP that exists in the Middle East. But this is kind of where you have to just kind of push through some of that and kind of keep thinking of different and more innovative ways of doing things. So again, if you are a common ISP, you might be in the Alexa Top 1 Million. So maybe we're going to say, hey, let's take things that are in the Alexa Top 1 Million and use them as a not filter. So anything that's in that list is not going to be deemed malicious. You can look for things like domain ages. So if you are a new threat actor and you're sending up a campaign, a lot of the actors will typically buy a new domain that might impersonate Gula Tech or, Tenable or something like that. Well, again, the real Tenable has been around for what, 20, 30 years at this point? So that's going to have a very long age. If this was something that was registered within the past couple of weeks or past couple of months, that could be used as another kind of filter. We also sometimes look at things like the X509s, where we see some, I want to say certificate issuers, like the primary one that comes to mind is like LuxEncrypt. People come out with them and they're supposed to be this privacy conscious thing, but it's frequently abused by threat actors. So we can kind of assign certain weights or scores to something like a LuxEncrypt versus a DigiCert that might have a better kind of job of doing due diligence.
Now, I've spoken a lot on the channel about threat intelligence, and you might know that an IP's reputation, right? I think you guys are partnered with Team Cumbre, probably a lot of other vendors, but you're also going kind of beyond that, right? So when you actually find something bad, how often, and we'll get to the Black Lotus labs here in a minute, right? But how often when you find something bad, I'm imagining you calling people in the government, people at other vendors and saying, hey, are you seeing this? Because if I'm right, I've got some nation state malware here and I want to make sure I'm right.
I would say that's a huge piece. I mean, just thinking about today, I think we talked to 2 or 3 different people in the kind of threat intelligence community. And again, part of this is people sometimes don't like this answer. Part of your job is networking and making friends with these people because you're going to have to kind of see each other. And this goes sometimes to our customers, sometimes our competitors, sometimes to government folks themselves, where we might have something that could be potentially impacting like AT&T. So we try to reach out to AT&T whenever we see something impacting them to see if we can potentially work with them to help get that patch issued before it starts coming into our network. And again, we kind of get tips like that all the time where we'll sometimes say, hey, we see something kind of weird that's happening in your network. Could you help us kind of investigate this to make sure that our anomaly detection sensors are right, or was this some sort of false positive? And the same thing with things like JCDC, where we try to inform them on threats to the industry.
And how much are you doing things like what I would consider DDoS? Like, so when I think about anomaly detection on the backbone of the internet, if someone's going to throw a couple, terabytes, petabytes, whatever big these days is, that's a big anomaly. But at the same time, you're also looking for things like, these hosts all of a sudden started connecting to every small office in San Francisco, right? Those are anomalies as well. So how do you kind of prioritize those kind of investigations?
So I want to say I'm actually super privileged because I get to focus a lot more on things like what we call the nation state malware. So we're focused a lot more on some of these higher end threats that originate from places like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And what we do is we've noticed this strong trend that we've been talking about now where we see a lot of PRC-based actors going after things like Sophos. So we're trying to basically create these signatures that try to signature the underlying composition of a botnet. So for example, we kind of talked about this, I think, a little bit with ZuoRat, where we were looking for ZuoRat, and as we were doing that investigation, we actually found what turned out to be this KV botnet. And when you actually started pulling apart parts of this, we found this one server that was used by a dedicated VPS that accepts things like Bitcoins, that had a self-signed X509 certificate. And when we started pulling the actual telemetry, we saw the only thing communicating with that was a Cisco RV32. And again, it's pretty easy to say, is this part of the Cisco infrastructure, or is this a Moldovan Bitcoin hoster? Well, if it's a multi-open Bitcoin hoster, it's probably not actually Cisco. So we can kind of do things to say, well, how do we see, what types of devices do we see connecting? How many different ASNs? Where is the actual provider? And again, you kind of assign some of those weights that we talked about before, and you can kind of use that to start to bubble up certain things where we can say, okay, this looks and feels a heck of a lot like a botnet. This doesn't feel like Gula techs getting their, automatics patch management every Tuesday. And again, part of that is also the time series component. Patches come out on Tuesday. We see a lot of influx on Tuesday night to Wednesday morning. If this is just pretty constant, it kind of feels, if it looks and feels like a DDoS botnet, it's probably a DDoS botnet.
That's excellent. Now, when you find something, you've got this sort of burden of proof, right? You don't want to be Chicken Little and call a vendor out, tell a customer that they've got malware. So you want to do this verification process. But at the same time, you also don't want to burn your partners, right? You probably work with other telcos, and this is a very delicate process. And one of the things I think you guys have done really well is you've set up your Black Lotus Labs, where you have a blog, and I've kind of joked about, the vendor threat blogs and that sort of thing. But and I'll pull it up here, but walk me through the what you guys are doing with the blog and what you're trying to accomplish.
So every now and then we see threats that we just feel are going to be really good for the public to get out there, or there's times at which something happened that, and again, we do our best to protect our customers, but we kind of see that there's going to be an impact beyond just the Lumen ASN and beyond the Lumen customers. So this is kind of our way of trying to announce, frankly, to the world and to all the other information security vendors, hey, we found something. We think this is pretty severe. We think this is pretty notable. We think you guys should also be aware of this, either for your own awareness or to try to put mitigations in place for some of these other companies where we just don't have the reach. Because we kind of see this world as being all interconnected through the internet, but we can't always do everything everywhere all at once.
And your name's on a lot of these blogs, and you try to publish this research. How often do you have to get this peer reviewed? Do you run it by a potential competitor or a potential vendor who hasn't fixed their stuff yet?
So we do our best to try to do that kind of stuff. We have a number of blogs where, again, we go through a pretty rigorous process where we work with our own internal Lumen counterparts. We have editors, we have lawyers. If we see things impacting certain vendors, we do typically try to reach out to them. Again, I think there was one we were talking about before with Versa. So I think that would kind of be a good example. We found a web shell that was impacting Versa web directors. And we actually saw that this one was targeting the actual product itself, and there appeared to be an exploit. We, as Black Lotus Labs, were not able to actually fix that exploit ourselves. We then had to contact the vendor, and we tried to share a copy of our research, try to explain what we thought that vulnerability was, and then basically kindly ask them to issue a patch and try to protect everyone else.
And it's interesting. So as an investor, when I was running, as an investor now, I deal with a lot of threat companies, right? And a lot of times the threat companies want to be the single source of truth for all threats on the internet. And it's tough to do that. It's really tough to do that. And I think in your own blog, you guys have kind of said, you know what, we're Lumen. You own what, 10% of the internet traffic?
We are Cicada's most deeply peered, interconnected network in the world.
That's amazing, right? But that's your strengths, right? You're not doing file integrity checks on stuff hosted in the cloud, right? You're looking at flow, you're looking at stuff like that, and based on that, you can put out a bunch of stuff. But I think you were telling me earlier that when you go back to some of your older blogs, we had the new Coney campaign kicks off, and you were telling me this was like the North Koreans, and this was sort of a, did you get scooped? Were you trying to do too much? But how have you guys changed over the years, and what happened with this particular threat actor?
So I think it's important to acknowledge some of the great things you do, and I think it's also important to acknowledge sometimes you have a bit of a stumbling block. So again, as I kind of mentioned before, I kind of had more of a traditional kind of threat intel background where we would look for things like malicious documents. They would typically download this loader file. We would analyze the loader file. We would sometimes try to get the main payload. We would then write detection and move on. So this is pretty much what happened in that case. This was what I would call just a classic spear phishing campaign. The kind of unique little twist that caught our attention is that they were actually weaponizing what looked like a Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs email address to compromise other Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials. But once you got it, it was a malicious link that would download a file. That file would download a loader. That loader would then download this payload, and that payload would do a reverse TCP shell like everyone else. the part that got me is I had this, it was right around the Christmas season, which is kind of ironically why I bring this up. The little decoy was actually this like Happy New Year's, some Den Rajdinia. And we were all ready to publish this, I think, the week after New Year's. And we noticed that there was another firm. I think it might have been Unit 82, but don't quote me on this. And they basically found the exact same lure, the exact same file, the exact same payload, and that they were basically publishing that, I want to say, I think about a day or so before us. So we then kind of had to rush out the door to say, no, we found this too, what, we're doing stuff. And that was just kind of, in my mind, this bit of an inflection point where we were trying to do what we had previously been doing, but that's when I kind of realized that we don't need to play that game. That's not the role we have in this ecosystem. We're not an EDR vendor. My job is not to do the file and hash integrities or look for Mac malware. My job is to protect an ISP. And when you really start thinking about an ISP, what it really is a whole bunch of networking equipment, fiber lines, DNS infrastructure. So why don't we focus on our strengths and try to find things that are targeting networking equipment like routers, trying to find things to go after firewalls like the KV botnet, try to look for things that are manipulating DNS records, because that's where we kind of have that competitive advantage for Insight. We have a lot more resources. We have the ability to kind of inspect that. And I think that kind of allows us to kind of have this very unique perspective where a lot of the other firms, they just aren't trying to do that.
I think it's a good perspective because it's a lot of humility. And again, a lot of people in cyber, they want to tell you that they're the expert. They're, follow my policy to be secure, and it's good to do that. But one thing I will pick on you for is that we were talking about, you were one of the first person to tell me about the router attacks.
Yes.
And I said, if I'm going to make a video about the router attacks, I want packets flying around the internet and stuff like that. So, I taught myself Blender, and anybody who watches the show, they know that we were doing all this kind of really, really cool stuff here with the routers, which was fun. I blame you 100%, but this was the visualization I was really kind of going for. One of the big attacks with router attacks is you can rewrite the packets when they're going through.
Correct.
This is like a big thing in our industry, right? We want IOCs. So I wanted to have a video here, and I'll turn down the volume, but I wanted to have basically somebody showing the packets being changed and being rewritten. Have you seen people do this for real?
Yes. So I think this was, I would argue, one of our big reports once we kind of hit that inflection point. This was a report we published, I believe it was called ZuaRat. So this was a piece of malware that was designed to target these small home office routers. And the interesting thing is that this took place around 2020. So this was right after the pandemic. Everyone was rushing home. During this time, everyone was basically working from their home office, and they didn't have that big defensive perimeter. So if you guys were remembering or taking your Feng Sangs classes, and pre-2020, it was defense in depth. You're supposed to have this super strong perimeter. You could build this moat, and then basically the moat just disappeared overnight. They were targeting these routers. We think that there was potentially some ODAs, some potential known vulnerabilities, and once they were on this, they were able to do things like packet sniffing. And they were able to see what kinds of DNS requests you're making. And as some of your listeners might know, the DNS requests are in the clear. So they could get all of that information without any sort of hassle. They could also do things like manipulate those DNS requests. So they could say, hi, I want to go to gulatech.mail. And in your mind, you don't actually look at that IP address. You just type into URL bar. And they could actually be manipulating that in order to get a kind of malicious man-in-the-middle attack and steal your credentials. They could also do things like that where they could redirect your traffic. So again, the kind of interesting component we thought to that is that you could even do this for something like a malicious agent. So again, a lot of times if you guys have ever reverse engineered like a Windows file, everyone knows that deep down you're going to see something that looks like a malicious domain, an IP address, maybe a Telegram channel, something that allows you to remotely interact with that. And that's typically pretty static. But what happens if you're able to say, hey, I want to talk to any IP address within this /24? What happens if you make it /16? In theory, you can never then really truly signature a whole /16. It's just too big. But if you then pair that with something like a malicious agent on the router can say anything that goes to this range, I want to redirect you to this one specific IP address. And you can actually kind of use multiple different agents together to create a more covert attack.
So that's just crazy. And I think a lot of people, when they are outside of cyber, they don't realize how I'm going to say fake and imitation is. Like the website you go to is probably cached at your local Comcast office, right? The DNS server you go to probably has millions of other websites on that server and whatnot. And then routers, it's not like you have a packet, right? Literally routers are just picking up a blob of bits on one side and transferring it over here. So if I can change that in the middle, why not? What has been some of the more recent things you've had to deal with routers? Are the vendors not being patched? Are the ISPs not applying the vendors? What are some of the bigger issues there?
So from my perspective, the biggest issues actually, and I hate to do this, we're having issues with some of our users. So what we try to do, and this is one of those things that I feel like people don't really like hearing. So we work for Lumen and CenturyLink. If you were to go home and say you were going to buy a CenturyLink line for your house, that way you can watch maybe a YouTube channel or Netflix, whatever it is you like to do in your spare time, you would typically get that box in the mail and you basically get told to plug this in and you'll have the internet. A lot of people will say, well, I don't need to tell my ISP and spend $4 a month for them to manage this. I'm going to go to Best Buy, Circuit City, or what have you and buy my own. The problem is that when you buy your own equipment, the onus to then patch that, to do some remediation, to keep that clean is then on the user. Whereas if you're working with the ISP, a lot of times we'll try to apply patches at 2 a.m. when everyone's presumably asleep. We'll try to help power cycle things to kind of keep them rolling. And we kind of have this part of the internet that I always call the forgotten part of the internet. So this is when people will either buy something like their home router, or maybe someone wants an IoT camera to see who's pulling into their driveway. Someone installs it, it stops working, the kid goes off to college, but it's still sitting there on the internet. It still has an IP address, it's still functioning, but you forgot the password to the app, so you just kind of leave it, and we'll get to that next week. There's just huge parts of the internet. There are just these random devices that just seem to be forgotten about. And I think that's really what's coming back to haunt us now.
How much in your day-to-day job are you using AI or I guess it's all big data, right? I mean, you're looking at all the flow for most of the internet, a lot of big data there, but how much AI queries or are you using analytics that you couldn't do with just a SQL or Splunk or other type of IP address type of query?
So I tend to shy away from a little bit of the AI. I'm one of those people who wants to know exactly what I'm querying, why I'm querying, and why certain things have certain wakes, because that's just the type of person I am. But it is very much I try to take what we call a data-driven approach, where the idea is how do we try to surface some of these anomalies by doing some, math theories? How do we implement things like graph theory for botnet finder, where we're saying, hey, this is exhibiting certain graph characteristics where all of these IP addresses that are talking to this one command and control server, will 45% of them also talk to this other IP address over here on port 443 at a different Bitcoin hosting provider? It's presumably possible that that could be where the payload's actually being hosted. So we try to take some of those more big data-driven approaches, but based off the size of what we're doing, you almost have to use something like PySpark, just because Splunk is great, but Splunk sometimes has some performance issues, especially if you have multiple people binging at the same time, all querying things differently. It can kind of start to sputter out a little bit. So like I said, we actually have our own kind of internal compute cluster. We have kind of a lot of our big data stuff with all the Hadoops, all of your PySparks, Apache Sparks, all that. And then we try to kind of surface some of those things that are just a little bit too compute intensive to sometimes do with just normal things like Splunk, or even trying to implement things like graph flames. It gets a little dicey, I think, sometimes with some of those SOARs that are more focused on those traditional host-based indicators.
So when you're doing this hunting, you're dealing with a lot of, I always try to there's a lot of personal stuff. You're seeing my flow when I'm going to Amazon, what I'm watching on Netflix. You might not be able to tie it to me, but maybe you could if you had the ad data and things like that. So you got Lumen, you got all your other peers that you're doing hunting with. Should we have a code of ethics in cybersecurity for incident responders, for people doing what I call mass scale threat hunting? Because you're basically dealing with the privacy aspects of these people, but you're kind of doing it for good. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it'd be good. I think it would be a good thing to have, but I think right now a lot of the stuff that most of us are doing in the space are typically bound by some sort of NDA. There's a lot of contractual requirements where, again, we're I will tell you at Lumen, we are only supposed to be querying for known malicious cyber activity. And again, we kind of have the test of, you can't be querying for an IP address if that's a potential ex-spouse, ex-lover, that, we would find that to be unethical, and we would try to report that to our internal stuff. But again, when you're dealing with this, you do have a lot of access to very deeply personal information. The issue is that, I'm going to be honest, maybe this is just me, I care more about finding the bad guys because that's what I get enjoyment of. I don't really care about people or what it is you're trying to do. And when you start dealing with a customer base and the millions, you don't really have the ability to start zeroing in on certain individuals unless you have some reason to believe that there is malicious activity. The other thing is I would try to rest assure some of your listeners, there's usually a lot of like end user license agreements and things like this, like the ULAs, where again, like, yes, we have access to information such as DNS, which could indicate where exactly you're going. But at the same point in time, all you can see is they went to Amazon. I can't see if you ordered a new camera. You might have ordered Ben & Jerry's. We don't really have all that because all we really get is what's called sampled metadata. So that can kind of give you some inclination about what's happening. And we can see, oh, looks like there is this large connection to AWS. In my mind, usually when I see AWS, I think of an S3 backup. I don't really think about, oh, are they ordering my latest book? Or are they looking at, new shoes? Again, part of that is just, we have our own kind of internal metrics where if I have to find malicious activity and I spend all my time thinking about what Ron's shopping habits are, I'm not going to hit my performance goals, and usually that stuff kind of surfaces up.
Well, if you know what I shop for, you might find the next blog entry for Lumen there. So let's go back to when we started. We talked about how you became a threat hunter. So if people want to become a threat hunter today, they can go to Cybrary. There's plenty of videos online. They can do the capture the flags, but that's geared towards what I consider cyber hygiene, right? Patching, intrusion detection, incident response on-prem, that kind of stuff. If I want to go work, where you work, if I want to do backbone analysis at scale, what kind of skills should I be teaching myself as a student?
I would encourage them to do, I feel like you're going to need some coding. You're going to have the ability to kind of run things like Apache Spark. Some familiarity with things like Hadoop are going to be great for basically any big data science job. If you have familiar with things like Scala, that's pretty universal depending on if you're at Facebook or wherever.
These are a lot of AI things you're throwing out.
And again, these are a lot of
data behind it.
This is the building blocks you would even use for things like AI. And again, I think that's a really good place. It also depends on what type of data you want to use once you're there. So again, I've kind of focused a lot more on things like the Soho devices, on the personal firewalls. Again, part of this is I would encourage your listeners to find that one piece of security that really appeals to them. When I first started, I really loved networking, which is how I ended up with routers. And again, this just kind of goes back to, okay, well, what makes this router better? Well, why is this more performative? Well, what makes it more performative? And it's just constantly iterating over those questions, doing a whole bunch of reading, and finding the area that really interests you. And this is kind of one of those very unique things that's happening now is cybersecurity is just diversified so greatly over the past even 10 years, where before it was just cyber hygiene of let's patch the mainframes and make sure there's no malicious cron jobs running. Now you have cloud security. We saw some stuff from Vluxy last week about close access. So now you have to worry about Wi-Fi security. You have backbone security, firewall security, router security, EDR-based security. Identity is a huge thing that's just emerged over the last 5 years and trying to learn Entra. There's so many different paths you can take. I would encourage them to try to almost take like a snapshot of each different area. And again, I think most people are naturally going to say, oh, I really liked, maybe IR, and I love doing the forensics, and I love recreating the process trees, and maybe that just appeals to you, at which point I would say, it sounds like you're going to go down an IR kind of reverse engineering path. There are some people who love Scala, they love the math, they love that, and I would say, well, okay, you're probably going to end up going down an AI path. I think they're all important, and they all kind of work together in an ideal sense to get that complete picture. But there's just no way any one person can do everything anymore. It's just gotten way too big.
So I've seen you talk at conferences. Some of the conferences are more off the books, just for incident responders and hunters and stuff like that. But I've seen you speak at a lot of different places. I'm gonna put up your LinkedIn profile here so people can contact you. But are you open to speaking at regional conferences and giving your thoughts on these things as they come out?
Absolutely. We've been doing this for the past year. I think actually we were just at B-Sides, New York City, I want to say a couple of weeks ago. So we were working with, I want to say thank you to our host down there. They were doing a great job. They actually brought in the local CUNY School, the City University of New York, and they were actually able to offer free admission to all the students. So we were able to kind of interact with them, try to give them their thoughts, try to expose them to the world of router security and some big data stuff. And again, that's something we've been doing for the last couple of years, and I look forward to doing that and engaging with the next generation.
That's awesome. Well, Danny, thank you very much for coming on the show. I will be putting his LinkedIn quote here or LinkedIn URL in the description. And I want to thank everybody for watching and hanging out with us this week. If you're interested in learning more about videos like this and subscribing, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or if you're watching this on X, give us a follow. Thanks again for watching. I'm Ron Gula from Gula Tech Adventures. I hope everybody has a great week.